Chuck, it's great to see you today.
Thank you, Jason.
Chuck, you're a squadron leader in the Navy, specifically with Navy SEAL Team 6. And you're watching very carefully what's going on now here in Ukraine where the war is being fought. And a lot of people, though, at this moment are talking about what's going on in southern Ukraine, that it looks like the Russians are making a lot of gains. What's happening there?
Well, it's principally southwest of Avdiivka. The Russians have been pretty much blocked trying to get into Pokrovsk. However, south of that area between Kurakove and Velika Novosilka, they have made advances. You know, the question is, are they sustainable? It's one thing to take some territory. It's another thing to hold on to it because there's a cost there. And I would also point out that this terrain has been captured not by dint of real ground maneuver warfare. They didn't capture it the way George Patton would capture it or Ulysses S. Grant. They capture it by throwing hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people against incremental gains. Again, so this is the kind of warfare that only Russia engages in, and that is high casualty, high material loss for low gain.
So are they really making substantial gains, though? And is it sustainable in the long run?
Well, you know, everyone talks about Russia's gains this summer. They have gained a little over 1% of territory of Ukraine. They have still lost 400 square kilometers of Kursk. So again, we're dealing with the situation. It appears that Russia's winning on paper, whatever that means, but we're dealing with unsustainable losses, right? There are over 700,000 casualties. And this year alone in 2024, they're going to lose 360,000 men. That isn't what winning looks like. And I'll go one more step. There is no plan for Russia to win this war. There isn't a Tet offensive coming. Sherman's not going to march to the sea. They don't have a solution to the quagmire that they're in.
So you mentioned Kursk. As you know, Vladimir Putin has said that his soldiers have to liberate all of Kursk Oblast. How soon do you think that's going to happen? And does it look like they're going to meet the deadline that he set?
Well, I think that deadline is a bit arbitrary and frankly a bit aspirational. Ukraine captured just under 1,000 square kilometers in their initial incursion. They still are controlling 400 square kilometers, but those are the core holdings. Those 400 square kilometers are around a very solid ground line of communication. And the Ukrainians have dug in for the winter. So they have got underground bunker complexes, interlocking fields of fire, etc. So they're at the core holding. Of course, we know that Russia is proud to tell the world they've put 50,000 troops to solve this problem, including somewhere between 10 and 25,000 North Koreans, but it isn't going very well for them. In the North Koreans' early contact phases, they lost 500 soldiers in one HIMARS strike, where they also lost or severely wounded one of their generals, very likely the North Korean general in charge of their special operations forces. So again, I don't think Putin's going to have this cleared out before Inauguration Day. And I think it's going to be a long, hard fight to get the Ukrainians out of Kursk Oblast.
So it's not just what's going on in southern Ukraine, which the Russians love to talk about. They talk a lot less about what's going on in Kursk, where they're just meeting a lot of failures. Even worse, their North Korean friends are losing a lot of soldiers. But what's going on in Syria? How's the Russian army doing over there? It seems that there's been videos coming out that they're running away in certain cases and abandoning the bases. What have you seen?
Yeah, that's exactly. During the opening of the Aleppo offensive, word was getting out that Russian forces were retreating for the coast. General Sergei Kissel was the Russian forces commander in Syria. He has, of course, been fired, which basically means he'll be going off a balcony later. He was principally fired, I believe, for not having adequate intelligence to realize this offensive was coming. And without resorting to the map too much, Aleppo was chosen as a rebel target because it will cut off the primary Russian supply and naval base at Tartus. It will cut that location off from Damascus. So this wasn't just a random opportunistic attack. Some serious professional military head scratching went into where to hit. So this is something that Russia has to respond to, and at a very bad time for them, because you don't just fire a theater commander and hire somebody new. There, as we both know, look, there are hundreds of people who work on a military staff. They're always handpicked by the commanding general. But now that guy's out, and you can't expect, frankly, a lot of help from Hezbollah, and you can't expect a lot of help from Iran, which is also in a military crisis right now. So, to put it slightly hopefully, things are going bad for Russia all over the world right now, including in Mali.
That's a great point. Let's discuss that. So we do see that Russia might be making some small gains in southern Ukraine, but globally, Russia's not doing so great, neither in Russia, in the Kursk Oblast, or in Africa, or in the Middle East. What do you see in these other places?
Well, I think you have got your eye on this really well, and we could use a nice discussion about what's going on in Georgia right now. That's where a lot of the world is paying attention to that.
Well, in Georgia, it's a great example. Ivanishvili, the richest guy in the country, controls the politics there, and he controls the largest political party, which recently won the elections. Now, there's obviously been a lot of allegations of voter fraud, but it seems that the government used a lot of very common tactics. For instance, they said in order to make sure there was no fraud, they would install cameras in all the polling places. And they made sure to call government employees before the election to tell them, we will watch how you vote, and there'll be consequences for your actions. So there's no actual fraud that can be proven because many people, probably did vote for the party, but they also voted for the party because they thought they were being watched. There was a lot of different methods being used by this pro-Russian government in order to make sure that they came to power. And what are the consequences? Well, almost immediately, this government has said that they will not consider and have any discussions about joining the European Union for at least a few years. So we've seen the protests in Georgia are growing. They've become larger and larger. And it's not just in Tbilisi, it's in Batumi and other cities as well. So as the protests get louder and bigger, it appears to me that they might have on their hands what was like the Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. The crowds just grew and grew. I mean, there's only two things that can happen. Crowds dissipate or they grow. In this case, it looks like they're growing. So in that case, we see that Russia is stretched pretty thin. It's not able, even in Georgia, keep in mind, 20% of Georgia is occupied by Russia. But even in Georgia, they are not able to force through their will. They're losing in Syria. Assad was in Moscow, remember, when the big offensive began last week. And even funnier than that, where's Vladimir Putin? Well, when Assad showed up to Moscow, Vladimir Putin was visiting his friends in Kazakhstan, and the Minister of Defense of Russia was in North Korea. There was nobody to meet Assad. So being stretched even further, we see that Russia's other endeavors have failed. In the case of Moldova, despite the fact that they used a lot of different oligarchs and such actors to try to influence the elections, in the first round, fortunately, the pro-European referendum passed. Barely, but it passed. And in the second round, the pro-European candidate had a very strong win. But Russia, I think, has just pushed themselves beyond what they're able to do. They don't have the capacity to have some sort of a massive global strategy and to realize it, to execute it. How do you see that? Do you see that playing out elsewhere?
Well, I wanted to focus back on Georgia for a second. And you made the comparison with Maidan. And in Maidan, as we're seeing now in Georgia, we see the crowds becoming more and more organized, being able to stand up more and more to the water cannons, the tear gas, and actually the poisoned water that is being sprayed on the protesters. It's a mix with incapacitant riot agents. How do you see, if this goes like Maidan, we will see an escalation in violence, not just brutality, but actually lethal force used by the government, as we saw in Maidan. You and I discussed a little while ago the use of special forces. I retreated the use of special forces in Tbilisi. Do you see the cycle of violence increasing in Tbilisi?
So that's always the trick. When there's large scale protest, a dictator that wants to stay in power, for instance, will always have a decision. He either has to not use any violence at all, or not lethal violence at least, and just hope that over time people will get tired, become bored, and especially now, wintertime, just not want to be there. And if you just wait it out, usually you'll survive it. Usually you'll get away with it. But when the decision is made to use lethal force, you better have the resolve to go all in. This has to be treated like Tiananmen Square. I'm willing to kill everybody who's there and to further suppress the population, to tighten up more and more, and to suppress all dissent. If you're not ready to go that option, if you're not ready to go full out dictator, then it's a huge mistake to use weapons. In the case of Maidan, the protests had grown for months and months. But what really changed everything, and where it became not just protests, but a revolution, was when Yanukovych's supporters, the military, fired on the protesters, killing some. And that just incited the crowds worse. The crowds at that point demanded vengeance. They wanted to avenge the lives of those who had been killed. And at that point, the government simply lost control of the situation, forcing Yanukovych to flee the country. So could something like that happen again? Could we see something like that transpire in Georgia? Absolutely the case. As the protests grow, I think there's a very good chance that something like that could happen in Georgia. What do you think?
Well, and there's something else I worry about in Georgia, and that is the proximity of Russian troops. They are already occupying portions of the country. Maidan, as you said, this was the judicious use of snipers to kill random people in the crowd. And it was basically the Boston Massacre. It had the same effect. It galvanized the resistance. I think a slightly complicating factor in Tbilisi is what happens if the Russian army shows up. And again, we're talking about a house of cards wobbling for Russian military endeavors around the world. In a certain case, it might be really good if Russia embroils itself in Georgia while it's trying to keep all of these other balls of dictatorship up as they juggle them around the world. But I think we're looking at. I agree with your assessment exactly. In fact, I almost expect it to go in the same direction that Maidan went, and I hope with the same results.
I also hope it comes with the exact same results. So, what we see, I think, everywhere is that though Russia has spent a lot of time, energy, and money trying to build up this global alliance with the dictators, they've just had one failure after another. The North Koreans showed up, were expected to be a game changer, and immediately tons of them get wiped out. We've seen that in the case of Syria. Assad was in Moscow because he didn't want to be in his own country when the large-scale offensive began. In the case of Georgia, the protests are just growing and growing. In Moldova, the pro-European candidate won. In the case of Ukraine, as you observed, it cost the Russians hundreds of thousands of soldiers just to take a few kilometers of land. That's not any sort of a strategy to win. So going forward, what do you think that we might see next, either globally or in Ukraine this winter?
Well, General Winter is going to come into play. Just on indications and warnings today, I was discussing, I showed some video of Russian soldiers sleeping on the ground. Okay, that doesn't sound like much, but anyone who is a backpacker or a climber listening to this, you can't sleep on the ground in the wintertime. It will kill you. Remember the million winter uniforms that went missing out of a Siberian warehouse, never to be found again. General Winter is going to come calling on the Russian troops. I don't think this is much of a crystal ball prediction, but hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian troops are going to perish on the zero line simply because they're not well equipped. They don't have boots. They don't have winter coats. They don't have ground pads. They don't have sleeping bags. And the burden for maneuver warfare during the winter is going to be on the Russians. Again, and talking about Kursk, if you are on the strategic defensive in the winter, you are putting all of the burden on your opponent who's going to have to attack you. He has to maneuver. He has to supply reinforcements. He has to keep his logistics moving. And all you have to do is wait for him to show up every morning. And it isn't much more complicated than that with the Russians. They attack in daylight, starting at 9 in the morning, and they carry on till 4 in the afternoon, which is why their casualties are abysmal. So I think it's going to be a long, tough winter for the Russians. And what we want to see is movement in Washington to reinforce and resupply Ukrainian forces so that they may truly have all the supplies in the bank, the ammunition, everything they need to conduct offensive ground maneuver operations in the spring. And hopefully that'll happen, Jace.
Absolutely. Russia's never been so weak. It looks like time is on our side. Chuck, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, man.